Yes.
I call David Ridsdale.
So, Ridsdale, would you take an oath on the Bible or an affirmation?
Affirmation.
Affirmation. Would you repeat after me? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly.
Declare and affirm.
Declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission.
That the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Yes, thank you. Take a seat. Yes,
Tell the Royal Commission your full name.
My full name is David James Ridsdale.
Made a statement dated the 15th of May.
That's correct.
The contents of that true and correct?
That's correct.
I tender that statement.
For the Exhibit 2815.
My name is David Ridsdale. I was born in 1966. I'm currently 48 years of age. I grew up one of 9 children in a large Catholic family in Ballarat. As others have expressed, my family was a key member of the community. Both my parents are from large families, and there are around 50 grandchildren on my father's side of the family. The religion of my parents was an all-invasive force in our lives, with every aspect centred on the Catholic community. My mother was secretary of St. Alipius Parish School and was involved in the school for over 50 years. My parents remained committed members of St. Alipius Parish. My grandparents lived opposite the Ridsdale Church, and my grandmother was like a mother to all the priests who resided there. As a young child, I enjoyed the liturgy and believed what the church taught. The church taught me that priests were something more than human with a direct link to God. They were incapable of sin. In my experience, the church had narrow parameters of sexuality and gender, and to fall outside those boundaries was a sin. The church dictated the boundaries of right and wrong, and the congregation's relationship to the clergy was one of submission rather than supplication. My uncle, my father's oldest brother, is Gerald Ridsdale. He was a Catholic priest in the Diocese of Ballarat. Gerald was treated like a shining light on my father's side of the family, particularly by my father's mother. I believe he represented the pinnacle of her Catholic achievement. As a priest, Gerald held, I'd just like to explain, I'm choosing to call by his first name, due to that we share the same last name. As a priest, Gerald held an almost supernatural level of power in our family and exerted a great deal of control over the family. He was treated as being better than his siblings and took full advantage of his exalted status. Gerald was charismatic and many were in awe of him. When Gerald came home to visit my grandmother, she would be extremely frantic. For example, hours before he was due to arrive, all of my father's 6 other siblings had to get their cars off the driveway. Everything had to be prepared for Gerald to smoothly drive in. My father has told me that as a child they used to call Gerald the God Botherer because he was a pious and horrible brother who lorded himself over his siblings in a superior fashion. St. Alipius. In 1971, I started kindergarten at St. Alipius Girls Primary School, which was co-ed school up to grade 2. Gerald was a priest at St. Alipius for part of this time. I remained at St. Alipius Girls Primary School until grade 2. In 1974, I went to St. Alipius Boys Primary School for grade 3. My grade 3 teacher was Brother Gerald Leo Fitzgerald. Every Friday at the end of school, Brother Fitzgerald lined up our class and we all had to kiss him goodbye, or potentially be strapped. Some kids got special kisses, meaning he used his tongue. This happened to me a couple of times, and I would see him linger with other boys. Sometimes Brother Fitzgerald singled out some of us to stay after class or come on his weekend bike rides. I went on a few bike rides with him. We would ride into the bush and countryside where Fitzgerald would teach us about the outdoors. He was both grumpy and affectionate, and at the time his lewd behaviour was not obvious. But with the benefit of hindsight, I can see the inappropriateness of his physical closeness. On one occasion, when I was aged 9 or 10 and in grade 4 or 5, I had to go to the sick bay. Brother Best was there. He was never my year teacher. He'd move very close to my body and touch me between my legs. He kept saying, "What's wrong with you?" I was scared and began to cry. He then relented. As I think back to this period in my life, I recall other similar incidents. I now realise I have ignored or excused other incidents in light of Gerald's action upon me. The best incident went into the growing pile of not as bad things that happened to me growing up. At the end of grade 5, the St. Alipius Primary School closed and we were reintegrated into the girls' school. I went to this school for grade 6 in 1977. I started to misbehave at this time and my parents put it down to the reintegration of the school, but this was not the case. When I was around 9 or 10, Gerald started to hang around my family home. He gave my family gifts and offered trips away for our large family, which obviously was rare. I remember one trip to Apollo Bay where we were invited to his place. My family had never been to Apollo Bay before this time. My mother fell pregnant with my younger sister when I was aged about 11, and it was a difficult pregnancy. Gerald began asking to help and offered to take me away for weekends on the preface of easing the burden. I was a pious young man and often suspect my mum was earmarking me for the priesthood. I think Gerald took advantage of this and used it as a means of getting greater access and time with me under the guise of preparing me. Gerald first sexually abused me on one of the school holidays when I was 11 years old and in grade 6. We were in a car on a parishioner's farm near Eden Hope where he was teaching me to drive. He stopped the car, undid my pants and began to pull my penis out to play with it. My naivety was so great at that point that I genuinely had no idea what was happening. I thought he'd broken my penis when the white stuff came out, as my ignorance of my body was so great. After this, Gerald took every opportunity to initiate sexual interaction with me. He mainly abused me during school holidays or on weekends. Initially it was masturbation, and then kissing, and then oral sex. I remember the first time we were in the bush somewhere and he tried to make me perform oral sex and I gagged. He used to get angry if I couldn't perform the way he wanted. He never fully anally penetrated me despite trying many times. One year, Gerald took me and 3 other boys to White Cliffs. I now know that 3 of us were molested by Gerald. One of the boys, who was a friend of mine, eventually told me that he had seen Gerald being over-friendly with me one time. Later, when we were about 17, he told me Gerald had tried to seduce him on that trip. He told me he backed away as he realised what was going on. My cousin was also present with his father. My cousin and I are convinced that his father was suspicious of Gerald and as such did not let his children alone with him. Sadly, my cousin's father died before taking any action. In 1980, Gerald was sent to Elsternwick in Victoria for a year, supposedly to study. In Elsternwick, he lived with other clergy. He used to take me and other boys to stay with him there. There was no effort to conceal us, and we would meet the other students in the common room before heading to his room. One time, there was myself and another boy sleeping in separate beds. Gerald would move between us from bed to bed in the same room. On another occasion, Gerald was at my grandparents' house with a boy who had been living with him while he was a priest in Mortlake. Gerald told me the boy was living with him while his parents were going through a divorce. I remember that while we were at my grandparents' house, he stood the boy on the table, was giving him Eskimo kisses and kissing him inappropriately in front of members of the family present. I cannot recall exactly who was there, but it was more than just my immediate family. I remember being disturbed that nobody said anything. I remember as my parents were driving home from my grandparents' house, someone commented that his behaviour with the boy was weird. Nothing else was ever said. On another occasion, when I was 13 or 14, my younger brother and I were walking out of the house just as Gerald was driving up to the driveway. Gerald pulled me into an embrace and kissed me on the lips in a sexual manner. My younger brother saw Gerald kiss me passionately. That same brother has told me years later that Gerald tried to kiss him in a similar way, but he pushed away and told him to bugger off. Gerald sexually abused me on a regular basis until 1982, when I was 15. I was abused in a variety of cities in Victoria and New South Wales, including Edenhope, Ballarat, Apollo Bay, Inglewood, Mortlake, Elstonwick, St Kilda, Whitecliffs, Mildura, Horsham and Wilcannia. I stopped counting after that. Gerald was not secretive about his love for boys or in having boys around or touching us. He would use his power and prestige as a priest to convince children and adults to trust him. When Gerald started paying more attention to our family, he began buying gifts for my parents. One I remember was a colour TV. It was the first colour TV we ever owned. Much later, my father said, I always wondered why he was so nice to us. I think one of my parents' biggest issues looking back is realising Gerald groomed them to get to me. St Patrick's. In 1978, I went to St Pat's College in Ballarat for high school. I stayed there until year 11. I experienced physical abuse there, but not sexual abuse. The school was run by the same Christian brother order that ran St Alepius. The teaching method was always firm, and the fairness depended on the brother you had to deal with. I don't know of any kids at St Pat's specifically who were abused there, but there were rumours from the boarders about some teachers. One example was a rumour of the music teacher who liked to get his baton and flick it in your penis because he thought it was funny, and then asked if you wanted it massaged. Another brother at the school once put his hands on either side of my head and got very close and intimate. I now perceive what he was doing was making a pass. At the time, I stood on his foot and told him to back off. He asked my name, and when I told him, he replied, "Oh, you are one of those Ridsdales." At the time, I thought it was because my older brother had been a difficult student, and I had always followed in his shadow. But looking back, I truly wonder what it meant. I remember another teacher whose classroom had to be soundproof due to the noise he made when he would fly into a rage in the class. He was the Form 5 and 6 maths teacher and a leading Christian brother in Victoria and Tasmania. I would often see his violence and aggression surface when he was angry. On one occasion in Form 5, he decided I hadn't answered a question correctly and threw my yearly notebook across the room, causing the pages to fall out. I questioned his action because I felt his reaction was uncalled for, and that turned into a huge verbal row. The next day, the headmaster called my parents, and although they listened to my side of the story, they said that such a respected mathematician and Christian brother could not be wrong, and therefore I was lying. I was given detention. Once again, I was reminded that religious clergy were more important than the rest of us and could get away with anything. For me, St Patrick's became a painful place to attend because I felt different to the other students. Disclosing. It was a long time before I knew I was being sexually abused. I just didn't know at the time. After abusing me, I was left alone with feelings and ideas I did not understand, with no one to talk to. The church was a leader in the social idea that gender and sexuality was a simple binary choice. In my experience, if a male did not present heterosexual traits, he was prone to ridicule and isolation. I felt I was completely alone and unable to tell any adult what was happening, especially as I started to struggle with my own sexuality. After Gerald started abusing me, my behaviour at home became unruly. I was prone to aggressive emotional tantrums and was extremely sensitive about any perceived transgressions on my part. I don't think my family made the connection, as I'd always been rather sensitive and different from my brothers. Gerald took advantage of this. My parents did not know what was happening on those weekends away with Gerald. But looking back, I realised some incidents should have been clues. For instance, one occasion, Gerald dropped me home. He told my parents they should check me for genital lice. He said I must have gotten it from his bed. I'm a parent now, and if it was me back then, I would have been asking, what was my son doing in your bed? I know there was no maliciousness on the part of my parents. I am sure if my parents had any inkling of what he was truly doing, they would not have been silent. My father has since said that if he had known at the time, it might be him in jail today. From the age of 15, I told a close family member on at least 5 occasions I'd been abused by Gerald. The 5th time, I bluntly said, Gerald has been molesting me. Rather than respond to my comment, the family member said, I hope one of your sisters will return to the church one day. It was as if they did not hear what I had said. Growing up, I was too afraid to talk what had happened to me. I didn't tell anyone until I was 15. As a teenager, I lived in terror that my growing sexual feelings were indicative that I had a predatory nature like Gerald. The church had done an excellent job of convincing not only me, but my whole family that sexual deviation was a terrible sin. To like someone of the same sex was a mortal sin and something a good Catholic could not do. I was too terrified to even consider the feelings I was having. My only sexual experience and education had been at the hands of Gerald, and I equated my growing inner feelings with his actions. It took many years to relieve myself of that disinformation. My reaction to the church was to lose respect and trust in it. I began to question everything and lost faith in the church. This caused huge problems with my parents as they wanted me to stay in the church and couldn't understand my animosity. I lost faith in all institutions and have held an individual worldview since. The sexual education I received at both school and church was almost non-existent. This left me feeling vulnerable and completely ill-prepared for understanding my sexuality, and therefore I had no capacity to understand what Gerald was doing was so wrong. When I was about 16 or 17, I began telling my peers about the abuse. I'd been working with people of my age in youth and social programs at the YMCA, and issues of abuse had been raised, which triggered memories and a new understanding of what had happened to me. I began to confide in my fellow volunteers, and almost without fail, all of them said that some form of abuse had happened to them. At the time, I had a perception that this was a normal part of society. I had kept my sanity through my teen years, through youth leadership at the YMCA, and through that program I had achieved national recognition. To compensate my horrible life, I threw myself into any project, to the point that at the age of 22 I was burnt out. I had been working 80 hours a week in full-time school as a psychiatric nurse. I thought I was trying to build a life, but what I was doing was hiding from reality. I left Ballarat for Melbourne and began a wide range of jobs, including music management, fruit picking, etc. I returned to nursing initially part-time to pay the bills before working at a private hospital. It was some time before I realised sexual abuse was not a part of most people's upbringing. Another response I would receive from adults around me that anyone who committed such acts should be killed, and anyone who was abused as a child was bound to repeat the cycle. This was the type of ignorance within society at the time about such issues. When I was about 20, I first wrote to Gerald expressing my disgust at what he had done to me. I never kept a copy of that letter and received no reply. The confusion inside me led to make many mistakes in my late teens, but I was determined not to follow in his path. At one point I rang a police number but was too scared and hung up the phone. When I was 21, I wrote another letter to Gerald, which I showed my elder sister before she sent it, actually. I again expressed my rage at how Gerald had manipulated me. I again received no response. Even though I had begun to tell family members and people around me, there was no strong encouragement to tell authorities or bring it to the attention of others. I was continuously told it was my decision to report it, but also reminded of the damage it may cause my family and the church. In 92 or 93, I began running a support group for Christian brothers who had been accused of child sexual abuse. I did this for some months. It was before I came out publicly. Gerald was in jail at this time, so my surname was associated with him. The supervising psychologist where I worked was fully aware of my circumstances and that although I shared the same surname as a convicted offender, I was one of his survivors rather than a relative. In retrospect, I am unsure of the professionality of that event. Up to that point, I'd told siblings and friends. One of the main reasons that held me back from telling others is that I did not want to hurt my grandmother. Her love and obsession of her son Gerald was undeniable. I loved my grandmother and was terrified that if Gerald's behaviour was public, it would kill her. The growing distress within me was too great and I needed to act. Not long after going public about my abuse, my grandmother became very ill. She was soon bedridden and then died. I never got the chance to speak with her again. When I was 25, my former partner and I were expecting our second child. I began having terrible feelings and dreams. My main fear was that I would turn into my uncle. I started feeling I was being abused all over again. It all became too much, and we decided something had to be done as it was negatively impacting my growing family. I did not know what to do. I was terrified of ringing the police. I was terrified to go public. I decided to ring George Pell. And I will only refer to him as George Pell. I have known George since I was born. He was a family friend. He used to attend church services and activities when he was an assistant parish priest at St. Alepius. We continued to see him even when he was headmaster at St. Aquinas Teachers College and School. Pell was an avid swimmer. I would often see him at either Eureka Stockade or YMCA pools. I have called him George from since I was a child. I have never recalled calling him. I chose to phone George on that day for one reason. He was the only human being in the church who I believed was still I could trust. At 9 a.m. on the 2nd of February 1993, I rang George from my home in Bentley. My partner at the time was sitting in the room when I made the call. I told George I had been abused by Gerald. His first reaction was, "Oh, right." His tone came to relatively quick, and I could. I started. His reaction was, "Oh, right." His tone came to relatively quick. I had been clearly concerned for my grandmother and was seeking access. Pain and distress was overwhelming. My take care of their needs. Things such as have to buy a car or the last 3 lines. "Excuse me, George, what the f*** are you talking about?" I said, "I want to make to keep you quiet." And my response was, and everything I stand for. I hung up the phone. As soon as I hung up the phone, I called my elder sister and told her about my conversation. I also called my second elder sister and told her about the conversation. I remember saying to both my sisters, "The bastard just tried to bribe me." I have never stated that anything specific or tangible in our conversation. To direct the conversation down a particular path made me extreme. Anything specific or tangible in our conversation. George was the first person in the Catholic Church whom I officially told about my abuse by Gerald. In 1994, while I was still working at the private psychiatric hospital in Brighton run by the St John of God nuns, I saw George Pelsons the first time since our conversation. George came to me and said, "Oh, David, how are you going?" He did not ask if I was all right or if I needed help or if he could do anything to help me. He had plenty of opportunity to call me and help me, but he never did. In the mid-90s, I saw George Pell again at a Ballarat forum after Towards Healing was introduced. The forum was supposed to provide an overview of the Church's response to the historical abuse. Pell seemed surprised the attendees did not believe the Church had been unaware of the conduct of its clergy. I called him a liar there, but I was actually the quiet one compared to some of the other individuals present. I recall one man said he wanted to kill Pell and the other attendees had to calm him down. I now understand this same man has committed suicide. Some days I don't know who I'm angrier at. And that never stops. Gerald for being a sick monster, or George for the way he reacted and dealt with the issue. Catholic clergy are meant to be the moral leaders of our society. But after my reactions from George in the Catholic Church, I have zero respect for him and that institution. After I spoke to my sisters, I was furious at George's response and I decided to call the police. I rang the Bentley police station and they said someone would return my call shortly. Half an hour later, the police returned my call and said, "Are you aware your uncle was to be charged later today?" I said no. Later that day, the police picked me up and took me to the police station for an interview that lasted many hours. I was told the charges to be laid against Gerald were going to be delayed for 24 hours so they could use my statement as well. The police told me I had to be ultra-specific about every instance of sexual abuse that I included in my statement. The police told me I had to be ultra-specific about every instance of sexual abuse that I included in my statement. So my initial statement contained with indecently insulting myself and several other boys from Edenhope. I hadn't been aware that Gerald had abused other kids at Edenhope, but was not surprised. As the case drew nearer, the police asked me whether I would agree to drop the charges Gerald refused to plead guilty to. The reasoning for this was that I was told to avoid the need to give evidence at a trial and that Gerald could be sentenced and jailed as soon as possible so they could release his name to gather more evidence against him. I agreed to drop half the charges against Gerald and as a result he was only charged with the more minor offences against me. Gerald was convicted and sentenced for sexually assaulting 8 boys, including me, on the 27th of May 1993. He was sentenced to 2 years, 3 months imprisonment, and he served 3 months. Initially, I was extremely upset at the brevity of the sentence and worried it was all going to be brushed under the carpet. My trust in institution and authorities was shaken after this. Throughout the gruelling process, the police were very good. They told me they feared there were many more victims of Gerald out there. They told me if I helped them by going public, they would make sure Gerald never got out of jail. They felt that a public face to what had been happening would encourage others to come forward. The police said straight up, "We can't do this without you." That was their promise and they have kept it so far. After the first criminal proceedings against Gerald ended, I did an interview with the Herald Sun. I expected a few people to come forward. As a result, maybe a dozen. From feedback I received from the police and the support group Broken Rights, up to 200 victims of child sexual abuse came forward after the article was published. There were many more victims of Gerald that came forward than I could have possibly imagined. In 1995, I did an interview with Who magazine. At that time, I referred to George Pell as a trusted priest. In April 1997, I told Outrage magazine the trusted priest was George Pell. In 2001, I was interviewed for the 60 Minutes program. When this program was released, there was a letter in the paper from a man who said he knew I was a liar. His reasoning was that no human being would dare swear at a bishop who holds such high regard in society. The bishop he referred to was Pell. I wrote a letter to this man and told him why I did what I did. He wrote back to me and said, "I have been sitting here crying for the last 4 hours. I am so sorry." In 2012, or maybe even later, recently, 60 Minutes re-aired this program. I didn't know they were going to do this, as nobody told me. I now know they told nobody. I only found out about the re-airing after my family rang me. Every time I have spoken out, there has been some backlash from the church, often from Pell. They would criticise me for inconsistencies with dates which they attributed to me lying, rather than consider the sloppy journalism at fault. The reason I say it was sloppy journalism, because every time I said I called the police the day before he was charged, they wanted to know the date. I said, I don't know, find out. The fact they didn't do their job properly is not my concern. The Diocese of Ballarat paid for 7 sessions of counselling for me after the criminal proceedings. I just did not feel that was enough. I started civil proceedings against the Catholic Church in 1993. I was not offered any more counselling. Soon after commencing proceedings, I was told by my parents that Bishop Mulcairns, who was bishop at the time, held a meeting with my parents and encouraged them to drop the case, to get me to drop the case. The meeting was held without my knowledge. My parents told me that Bishop Mulcairns refused to acknowledge any inappropriate conduct on the part of Gerald. The church made me an offer of $10,000 to resolve the proceedings. My lawyers, Williams, Winter and Higgs, advised me if I did not accept the $10,000 offer, I would be dragged through a court case that I would never win, not in a million years. They went on to advise me I would end up with a $60,000 to $100,000 bill which would destroy my family and my life forever. At that time, I was a terrified 25-year-old with absolutely no support from anyone. I rejected the offer. The church made a second offer of $30,000. I begrudgingly accepted this offer after I was made to feel scared and convinced the church's legal status as a non-corporate entity meant they could not be legally challenged. At no point did the church ever say words to the effect of "how can we help?" I think that could have made a big difference in my life. When my extended family first found out that I was abused by Gerald, some of them called me a liar and said, no, none of that really happened. One of my cousins refused to believe Gerald had ever done such a thing and called me a liar. Other members shrugged off my story and said, oh, you know, David, he's emotional and sensitive. Other family members have accused me of being a gold digger, or that it was so long in the past I should have moved on by now. I know most of these responses are due to ignorance in understanding abuse and its long-term insidious impact. My grandmother's funeral was one of the last major family events I've been to on my father's side of the family. My family have difficulty talking to me about the abuse, Gerald, or the church's involvement. It's too painful for them to think about. As I ask too many questions, I am unable to keep my head buried in the sand. My mother is still a devout Catholic and cannot understand why none of her children go to church anymore. She thinks it's a failure on her part. My daughter asks me, why does Nana go to church? Does she not know how much it hurts you? I try to explain to my daughter that my parents grew up in a different era and that my mother genuinely believes that hell is a real place. I've never told my mother that it hurts me, that she still goes to the same church, St. Alypius, but it does. My cousin, who was also abused by Gerald, told me he was told by some family members that if he ever took money or compensation from the church for the molestation, anything he ever bought with it would remind him of this abuse. One of my aunts still visits Gerald in jail. She claims she does it in honour of her mother. I don't think my grandmother would agree. With the church being such an integral part of my family's life, the fallout from revelling, my grandmother would agree. With the church being such a understanding of the impact of abuse and the shame of Gerald makes it painful for them to discuss it. This inadvertently making me feel more alone to deal with the damage it has caused me. I have become adept at hiding my pain and creating a strong persona, as I don't like letting the bastards win. My family's involvement in moving Gerald. At his funeral, one of my aunts said to me, I've known for so long. I replied, sorry, what? She said, oh, well, you know, in Edenhope when it got too much and we got told about it. She then told me that she and her husband, who was a policeman at the time, had helped move Gerald quietly out of Edenhope. I reacted harshly towards my aunt, as Gerald had been abusing me at that time. My older sister was standing next to me. My aunt was very surprised at my reaction and became upset. After this interaction, I was left standing in the hallway alone, being ignored. Everyone was talking to each other about how hard it was on them. I suddenly put my hand up and said, excuse me, everyone, I was the one fucking raped. I don't know if they heard me. I then walked out. I confronted my uncle, who had been a policeman, about his involvement in moving Gerald from Edenhope. He categorically denied involvement. Other family members were told I was lying about what my aunt had said at the funeral until my sister reminded them that she was there and had heard it. This same uncle then tried to excuse my aunt by saying she was not mentally well and had had a breakdown and had made up the comment. She was admitted to a clinic for treatment. I've since found out that when Gerald was moved out of Edenhope, the same aunt had a conversation with another aunt about suspicion of Gerald's inappropriate behaviour. From that day onwards, none of their children were allowed to be alone with Gerald. They both appeared to have known at the time about Gerald's behaviour, but chose not to warn their siblings and the rest of the family. There's a small spelling mistake in this next line. I have been asked when the abuse stopped, but my response is that it has never stopped. What Gerald did was the result of a pathetic man unable to make correct choices. The combative approach from the church and their efforts to paint me as a liar were just as painful to my life as the abuse itself. Discovering that the church leaders were aware of his abuse of others has shattered my trust in social institutions. The impact of my abuse has been a complete invasion of every aspect of my life. The upbringing I received in the church ensured my naivety was so great I was unaware of what Gerald was doing to me. My fear of being different and a sinner in the eyes of the church meant I was sure it was me doing something wrong. My personal sexual journey was completely disrupted and poisoned by the actions of Gerald. My inability to trust anyone enough to tell them was a result of the church dogma and supernatural regard of its leaders. When I told my father this, he agreed and said that sadly I was probably correct, and at the time no one would have believed me. It is hard to contemplate the dark space I was in during my teenage years. It's actually really difficult to even remember that disturbing time. I lived in terror of turning into Gerald, and the continuing conflict inside of me ensured that relationships were difficult to maintain. Trust of others was non-existent. That's sort of been changed. The worst part after the trials was meeting other victims of Gerald at an event organised by Broken Rights. Name tags were provided, and of course I'm the only one to share his name, making it difficult to interact because I would be judged on my last name. But many of us were able to start putting our stories together, and we quickly realised that on the same day, Gerald would abuse one of us in the morning, another in the afternoon, and a third in the evening. And the reason we know was because public holidays are when we met. I've spoken to a couple of victims about the games he'd play, how he'd say, "You're my special one." One boy told me he was jealous of me, and in turn, I felt dumped when another boy came along. I could not even contemplate this perversity back then. I now suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and a number of ongoing interpersonal problems. I am not receiving any support at the moment, but last year I did a PTSD support program in England where I now reside at my own expense. It was extremely good, but it too opened up a lot of wounds. The goal isn't suppression, it's management. I need further and ongoing PTSD support. I have become very good at fronting the world with a strong persona, but you only have to ask those close to me how much this affects me. I am very cautious and selective of who I let in my inner world. I am lucky I have people I can share the pain with no judgment. When I tried to get help from the Catholic Church, my calls for help were ignored. I got the impression the Church was more concerned with protecting their institutional structure than actually listening to me. I was asked to sign a confidentiality agreement when I received money from the Church. This made me feel the Church was offering to buy my silence. I decided to tell the truth no matter what. I have lost a great deal every time I've gone public, but I know my actions. I know my actions in 1993 and beyond have helped in a small way to lead to this Royal Commission, and for that I am extremely grateful.
Does anyone else have any questions? Mr. Gray, I need to say the same to you about the allegations in relation to Cardinal Pell, as I said to you before lunch. Do you understand?
Yes, Your Honour. I thank you for that reminder. Our position, as I said, is that I explained yesterday that the stance my clients were taking to this hearing would be that in general we would not question witnesses whose task is difficult enough as it is. In the case of the telephone conversation about which Mr. Ridsdale has given evidence, the Commission is aware that the Cardinal has publicly and repeatedly said that his recollection of that conversation is quite different. If and when the Commission asks the Cardinal to provide a statement, which we assume will happen, I expect that he will say the same thing.
Well, two things about that. Yes, we will ask, but as you appreciate, you could have the Cardinal make a statement yourselves. That's a matter for you, but he will be asked. But there should be no misunderstanding, merely because of the stance which the Church has otherwise taken. When it comes to issues of the Church's response, or individuals in the Church response to abuse, They are factual matters that we must investigate and determine.
We understand that, Your Honour, and we will approach it in the way that I have mentioned.
Thank you.
Can
Yes.
I make a comment on that? Is that possible?
Maybe better not to, I think, Mr Ridsdale.
Oh, just the Commission itself, I wanted to, just actually a positive one on the Commission.
Well, I don't want you to traverse
No,
the
I
controversy.
won't go across into that area. Just, it's actually about the experience of doing this.
Yes, that's fine. You can say what you want to say about that.
Yeah, this has been an extraordinary experience from the point of view of in 93 and in 2001 there was no support, and as I was one of the first, I bore the brunt of the Church's reaction, and so I am extremely pleased to see how far we've come, and hearing the other men's stories has triggered an enormous amount of flashbacks and memories, things like I'd forgotten about being made to sleep at Fitzgerald. I'd forgotten about standing in my parents' roof wanting to jump off but being afraid that I'd only hurt myself and get in trouble. So I'm so pleased, and I hope that the Commission can take it further and remember that there is a lot of young people out there in an extremely dark place in their teen years suffering from being abused, and we now know from research that the earlier we get to those people, the less chance they will hurt themselves and those around them. So I would hope that some process is put into place where young people are allowed to speak about their dark thoughts, to come to terms with them, and that somehow the Commission is able to point out to the Church that their stance on sexuality and gender is completely out of line with modern research, modern thought, and they are out of step with the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Ridsdale. Thank you for your evidence. You are now formally excused.
Thank you very much.